Welcome to OceanWise. My name is Dr. Gwen Goodman-Lowe, and I'm a marine biologist at Cal State University Long Beach. Today I have with me two experts in their fields, Dr. Christine Whitcraft, who is a wetlands restoration ecologist, and Dr. Chris Lowe, who is a fisheries biologist. Today we're going to be talking about seafood, things that are involved in seafood, what we do with seafood, how we've gotten to where we are today, and what seafood security means. Chris, what does seafood security mean?
So often when we talk about food security, we talk about how are we going to feed the masses, and that's always been a big concern. Of course, when we talk about seafood security, instead of talking about grains and agriculture and things like that, we're actually talking about will we be able to produce enough seafood from the marine environment to actually feed growing populations. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about seafood security, is where's our seafood going to come from in the future to sustain growing human populations.
That's great. So my next question is, our human population has grown exponentially since about the mid-1700s. So what do you think we're going to do about that? How are we going to feed all of the people that we have on our planet?
So if we can have figure one. So in figure one, it's kind of amazing because the human population has grown exponentially in the last few hundred years. And really what allowed for that was our ability to domesticate crops and domesticate animals on the land. And really, we would never have the human population growth that we've been able to sustain if it wasn't for that ability. And of course, some of the things that made that work was the fact that people own private land and they could cultivate that land and then sell that as a commodity. With the ocean and with seafood, it's been very different because we go out and harvest wild things as a way of providing food sources to other people. And the challenge there is nobody owns the ocean. It's a public access sort of thing. So it's much more difficult to regulate, to control, and more importantly, to even measure how much impact we're having on that environment. So historically, what's enabled us to put 9 billion people on the planet was our successful ability to domesticate plants and animals. And we haven't even really done that successfully or tried very hard with marine animals.
Christine, how have our food preferences changed over the course of the history of, animal production?
Well, that's another story about food preferences changing over time. So it used to be that people who expected fresh seafood were the people on the coasts. But now we expect to have seafood wherever we live and whenever. And that has really affected how our diets are. So if we could see figure 2, you can see in the figure that per capita, per person, we've increased our protein intake dramatically. And a large portion of that increase have been through seafood. And so in order to facilitate this increase in the protein we're eating and the increase in seafood and delivering it wherever we want it, we've had to change and improve the ways we freeze it, package it, ship it, and generally move seafood around. We also have seen that to deal with this, we have to increase our ability to catch fish. Primarily, that's been done through increases in marine fish capture, but we've also seen that we've had to increase some aquaculture. And as we'll talk about later, there's a larger increase in wild caught than there has been in aquaculture.
And going along with that, it's really been some of the developments in fisheries technology that's greatly enhanced our ability to harvest in the ocean. And it's literally been the last 100 years. So people used to go out and fish by hand lines, and now we're using big commercial factory ships that are putting up miles and miles of nets or hooks. So that has greatly changed how efficiently we've been able to take things from the ocean.
And we use marine organisms that we're taking for more than just food too. So it's important to note that we see them in different products, in feeding livestock, in pharma industry, in all sorts of different ways. And there's even a significant portion of what we take from the ocean that we don't use, that ends up being discarded at sea. So just what we see in the protein graphs doesn't necessarily even reflect what we take from the ocean through these new improved technologies.
So obviously the demand for seafood has changed dramatically and increased dramatically. So Christine, what kinds of seafood do we actually eat? What do people prefer? And how much are we actually eating?
So if we could see figure 3, people in the US consume about 5 billion pounds of seafood every year. And as you can see, it's primarily within certain groups of fish and shellfish. We don't have that diverse a range of species that are consumed in the United States. However, that's not true globally. Different cultures prefer a much wider range of seafood. And as people have moved around, we've seen the preferences and the type of seafood we consume change globally as well. So that we're moving beyond just these fish and shellfish that you have, and we're starting, to see more diverse shellfish consumed within the United States. That has also led to a global trade in seafood, that we are eating not just the fish species available here, but fish species from all over the world.
Chris, what about health and seafood? I know those two things are related. How has that impacted the wild populations, and how has that affected aquaculture?
So believe it or not, health concerns have greatly changed Americans' preference for seafood. So it was back in the 80s that it was demonstrated that Americans in particular had a diet largely constituted from meat products. So cows, chickens, pork, some of which have very high fat contents. And it was shown that heart disease was a major problem for many Americans, largely attributed to their diet. And it was about that same time that research was being done that showed seafood actually being a low-fat kind of meat product, high-protein source, but we're also high in things like omega-3 fatty acids, which are good for your heart. So around the 80s, there was a big push to get Americans to eat more seafood because it was better for their health. And what that did was it drove a new surge in demand for seafood. So that, of course, put greater tax on many of the species that were already being over-harvested in some cases, or increased our demand on imports of many of the seafood products that we couldn't even get here in the U.S.
That's really interesting. Can I have figure 5, please? So, all right, we know that we're having an issue with overfishing at this time, and we know that aquaculture is going to play a part. So, Chris, can you tell us what the main contributors to overfishing have been?
So what we've basically seen was in the early days, fishers went out and they targeted the biggest things. And we like those sources of protein. They taste better to us. They have higher fat contents. So many of the things high in the food chain were the first things that we targeted. And as we began to deplete those things, we began to do what we call fishing down the food web. We started fishing deeper and deeper down the food web towards smaller and smaller things. And as we depleted those resources, then we started to do what's called fishing through the food web. So now we have multiple fisheries fishing at all these different levels. And as we depleted those resources, we did what's called food web expansion. We actually started looking for new environments to exploit. And a great example of that is deep sea fishing. So for example, 100 years ago, we couldn't access those depths. We couldn't access things there. And now we can with the technology that we have. And unfortunately, many of the things that live in the deep sea grow very, very slowly. And they're not even considered fisheries. They're considered mining. Because once you extract them at a certain level, they just can't come back.
Christine, I know that sport fishers often don't think they have a big impact on the total number of fish that are being caught. So how do you think recreational fisheries play into this?
So a lot of the story that we hear has to do with what Chris was just talking about commercial fishing contributing to declines, but there is a role for recreational fishing in these declines as well. If I could have figure 7, one of the examples here in Southern California that I like to talk about is the California halibut. So there's both a commercial and recreational fishery for the California halibut, but it is still caught in the recreational fishery. And we've seen declines in the halibut population that are related to these fisheries. It's also linked to a complex problem of habitat loss. So California halibut are wetland obligates. The larval fish swim into the protected embayments and wetlands to use the habitat. And without those wetlands, they don't have a thriving population. So we've both overfished them, and in destroying some of our habitat, both in terms of the area and the quality, we've reduced the ability of the populations to recover. So not only is it commercial, recreational fishery, but it's how we choose to use our land that often contributes to these declines.
That's great. So Christine, since you are a wetlands restoration specialist, can you tell us how wetlands are actually nursery habitats?
So wetlands are a different habitat along the coast because as opposed to the beaches, these are protected, lower flow, they don't have wave energy. They often have habitats like eelgrass, which is a type of underwater plant. And in those areas, the young halibut are protected from predators. They have ample food sources, and they are generally able to grow faster than they do than they might in other habitats without those specialized resources. So it's really important that we, emphasize their role, and that's why we call them the nursery habitats.
That's great. Chris, can you tell us how recreational fisheries have changed over the last few years?
Well, if I can actually have figure 6. So, California's original economy was based strongly on commercial fishing. And ports like San Francisco, San Pedro, San Diego were major suppliers of seafood to not just California, but to many of the states just west of the Mississippi. And then what we've seen is a loss of those commercial fisheries in California, a lot due to overfishing and stronger regulations. But we've seen recreational fishing grow in popularity, particularly after World War II. And now it's estimated that there are over 1 million recreational anglers that fish in Southern California alone, and that industry generates $1 billion in revenue to our local economy. Now, not all those fishers are fishing to catch food to eat. Most of them do, but many of them fish for pure recreation purposes. They fish to get out in the water, and many of the fish they catch, they release. So what we've seen is kind of a reversal, where commercial fishing had some of the biggest impacts on fish stocks. And now as that's going down, recreational fishing is starting to create some of those impacts. So managers have to control for both recreational and commercial take, and you have to share what's available out there.
So what you're saying is that the commercial fisheries have declined and the recreational fisheries have increased, right? So what has actually happened to those commercial fisheries? Where have they gone and why?
So many of those commercial fisheries have simply gone out of business. As fisheries grew, they overcapitalized. In other words, fishers were buying boats, they were taking mortgages out in those vessels, they invested a lot of money, and then because the fisheries started to decline because they weren't being well managed, many of them had to give up their business, so they had to lose their business. Others actually switched to different fisheries, and they had to invest in more gear, they had to invest in more technology in order to keep working their way through fisheries. And then some of those boats have actually left the country. They've moved to other countries where they fish there, but their fish are imported back into the US. So what we've seen is a large scale export of commercial fishing from not just California, but the US.
Christine, how has this impacted the import of seafood then into the United States?
So as we discussed in the beginning, there is this challenge that we have a demand for seafood, a need for the healthy protein provided by seafood, but yet we're having a diminishing ability to potentially get that from in the United States. So there are still, there are some fisheries, but there is this dilemma of increased regulation that have resulted in fewer fisheries. The local fisheries we do have often are sustainable, but they tend to be pricier, which we'll discuss. So what we've seen is a lot more imported seafood. And when we're importing seafood, it's often difficult to keep track of where exactly we're importing it from, what the sustainable practices were, or if they were sustainable from other countries, and sometimes even exactly what species is being imported. And so our estimate is that we import about 80% of our seafood, and of that, 50% of the imported seafood is produced from aquaculture in other countries, which we see as the complicated picture of the global trade and the relationship to fisheries and habitat change here in California and the United States.
And that's actually part of the challenge, right? So part of the challenge is we want to have sustainable fisheries in our country. We want Americans buying American seafood, but it's become cost prohibitive in some cases, especially because imports are so much cheaper. So part of the challenge comes from education. We have to re-educate the public about what's local and why is better, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure. But these are some of the challenges that we're facing in terms of how do we keep that industry going and not over-regulate it, but yet make them sustainable.
Chris, do you want to talk about some of the species that we import and where they come from?
Well, so in the US, we don't have a lot of tropical species. I mean, we don't have a lot of tropical habitats that we can fish, right? So we have places like Florida and some places off the Gulf of Mexico. So any things like snappers and groupers quite often have to come from other places. And because of tightening regulations on those species in tropical places, more tropical places, means that it's harder and harder for Americans to get, US caught fish. When it comes to more temperate species that live in cooler water, that's where the US does a little bit better. But then you get to more polar species where some of the highest abundances in biomass for things like pollock occur. Now you might get to places where we have to import most of that. But what's amazing is that a vast majority of our seafood is coming from other countries, and it's actually not seafood at all. It's freshwater species that are being cultured in much larger systems in other places. And quite often, Americans have a hard time telling the difference between what was a freshwater species and a saltwater species.
So Christine, Chris just told us that we don't even know if our fish are freshwater or saltwater. So how do we actually know where our fish are even coming from, where our seafood is coming from?
Well, one good indicator is price. It's probably not surprising that a sustainable local fishery might cost more. As we talked about, there's more regulation in California. There's often small-scale fisheries using lower impact techniques. And if I could have figure 8, we often see that these sustainable fisheries are more unusual species. So in this figure on the left, you have our preferred seafood, which are hard to know the source of, often coming from imported areas. And in the shopping cart on the right, you have the local, often sustainably caught species. So they may be ones that aren't as desired, which also affects their price. And so what we need to do is sort of bring in line what we're willing to pay for seafood to have it done right, and adjust our preferences to reflect those locally caught seafood as well.
This sounds very confusing in my mind. So Chris, how do we as consumers figure this all out?
Well, that's been part of the challenge. So part of the challenge is getting Americans kind of re-educated to seafood and being smarter about our food to begin with. Where does it come from, and what is the quality like? And historically, people who lived along the coast went out and caught their own fish. And many recreational fishers are actually very good at identifying high quality fish and because they actually catch it and flay it themselves. But after that, things that you get in a restaurant, things that you might buy in a supermarket become very difficult to identify what it actually is and where it came from. While there is certain labeling requirements by the FDA and USDA about whether it's been fresh or frozen, in most cases, people are eating fish that's been dead for 6 to 8 months. But if it's been properly taken care of, it should taste relatively fresh. One of the techniques that people are using, because there's been a lot of false labeling of species, are DNA techniques. So researchers are actually going to restaurants and supermarkets and buying fish and then going back and testing it. So they may call it red snapper, but it turns out to be a rockfish. Or it may be red snapper, it turns out to be a wrasse. So this is a challenge. This is something we really have to overcome. And the more consumers ask for where their fish came from and what is it, the better things will be.
To be honest, this sounds a little bit depressing to me. Thinking about overfishing and how hard we have to work to try to get our fish and figure out where they're coming from and who's giving us what. Christine, are there any kind of solutions to these problems?
Well, the good news is hopefully we can lift you out of the depression. And I'm going to defer first to my background as a wetland ecologist. And habitat restoration is a really important way to be able to restore these fisheries. So if we have habitats that support the young fish as nursery habitats, the adult fish and the young fish as feeding grounds, we can improve the quality of the existing habitats and the quantity of the wetland habitats in general. And this is a really effective way to support the offshore and the inshore fisheries of the species we care about. We can also use local examples. It doesn't have to be a massive restoration to see changes. So if I could have figure 9, this is an example from the city of Long Beach, where the Colorado Lagoon is a small acreage property located in the heart of Long Beach that was really degraded by pollution and development around the edges. This before picture shows basically a shore devoid of plants. There was contaminants, and that didn't support any healthy fish populations to speak of. And then if I can have figure 10, this is the lagoon post-restoration, where you can see that not only is it more beautiful, but there's a thriving ecosystem there where we have plants that filter runoff into the lagoon. The contaminated sediment has been removed. We're starting to have habitats like eelgrass that support fish populations. And it's these, seemingly small, but really important restorations that can make a difference in the type of fish we can support. So that's one step that I think provides hope because we can see the change, but also does make a really big difference in the populations of fish we can support.
So it sounds like there is some hope then.
Yes.
So Chris, are there any specific tools that regulators can use to actually help manage this?
Well, what we're starting to see are much better fisheries management practices that go beyond just telling fishers how many they can catch and what season they can do it or what gear they use. So obviously restoring habitat is going to be essential, right? But also we need to start looking at setting areas aside where people can't do anything. They can't take anything. They can't harvest anything. And those areas, marine protected areas, are becoming very important in terms of bringing species back. So I think one of the keys will be fisheries managers are going to need more in their toolbox than just the standard, we're going to limit how many fish a fisher can catch. And I think we're already starting to see some of the benefits of that.
That's really interesting. We haven't really talked about aquaculture yet. So Christine, can you tell us a little bit about aquaculture and if it's good or bad, and is it working to help bring seafood to people's tables?
Well, as this demand for seafood increases, we're going to need to diversify and increase that toolbox that Chris talked about. And aquaculture is one of those tools. So aquaculture, we discussed, can help supplement the seafood so that we're not just using wild-caught fish. 90% of our seafood is imported. 50% of that is aquaculture from other countries where we don't know how it's been done. We don't know about environmental regulations. We don't necessarily know what it's been through and processed. We can research really good ways to do aquaculture here in the United States. We can do it with shellfish or fish and be able to control some of the impacts of aquaculture in ways that we can then know how it was done and where our seafood came from, and at the same time support a U.S. made, or should I say grown, product.
So you did mention that a large percentage of our fish that is grown or is imported. So why is the U.S. so far behind on this aquaculture thing?
Well, aquaculture hasn't been without its challenges. When we've had aquaculture in the past, there's been problems with antibiotic use, pollution from particularly fish farms, harmful algal blooms that have resulted from it. And honestly, those are real problems, and aquaculture got a bit of a bad reputation. So we need to find ways that we can address those problems in a way that we can meet our food safety and environmental regulations, because those are very important in the US, but at the same time be able to scale up to have aquaculture produce enough food to meet our protein and seafood demands.
So Christine mentioned about fish farms. So can you tell us a little bit about offshore fish farming?
So if we can have figure 13. So historically, most aquaculture is done inshore, right? It's either done in coastal waters or it's done in estuaries. And we recognize there are big challenges in doing that, in that you create pollution, you just don't get the same water exchange. Whereas now there's movement towards farming offshore, and they actually refer to it as ranching. So quite often fishers will go out and encircle an entire school of tuna that are small, but they'll drag that back and set up a pen near shore, and then we'll feed them from local forage fish to kind of fatten them up and get them ready for market. So in many ways, it's almost like a ranching process. And that tool is something that has not been used in the US, and it's just now starting to be employed. So right now off the coast of Southern California, we have a large-scale mussel farm going in offshore, where we're relying on the plankton in the water to help grow those mussels faster than you could even inshore, and reduce the problems that may be associated with pollution and coastal development. So I think there's a good move in that direction, but there has to be a lot of careful planning in terms of where we put these and how we regulate those.
So there is some good news, is what you're saying, and we as a consumer can actually have some input into how we manage these fisheries really by what we eat. So Chris, can you tell us about the Seafood Watch program and what that's all about?
So aside from what fisheries managers have done to try to bring stocks back and all the different things that we've done to improve the coastal environment, really fisheries management comes down to the consumer. If we're smart consumers, we can determine what is a good fishery and what's sustainable and what isn't. And quite often we need that information. So Monterey Bay Aquarium has the Seafood Watch program. So if I can have figure 14, what they've done is all the homework for us. So they've done all the investigations of all these different fisheries to determine which ones are more ecologically sound and which ones are more sustainable. So they give you a good fish to eat, or a good shellfish to eat, and they give you a not so good and a bad. And what that does is it gives the consumer the power to decide what they do or do not want to eat. And that's what truly regulates fisheries. So I think that this is moving in the right direction, but it's going to require the consumer, us, to be savvy consumers of seafood. We're going to have to do our homework.
So I've heard of the Seafood Watch program. I've also heard of farm-to-table situations for things that are grown on land. Christine, are there farm-to-table companies and situations that are for the ocean for seafood?
Yeah, it's a really exciting way that people are trying to develop a way that individuals can feed into this process. So these are called community-supported fisheries, and the idea is just like community-supported agriculture is, that in buying locally, you can make a connection with your local fishermen and use the fish or buy the fish that they're getting. They often, as we said, are using the lower impact practices. There's potentially less of a carbon footprint from transportation, and they really are a way that we can support the coastal culture we have here in Southern California. And one of the ways that we've been talking about it is that individual choices make a difference. When you're seen by your neighbors and your friends and your kids to go out and make these choices, you can make a difference. You're supporting the fish that are available, and you're supporting potentially the fish for the future, all by making responsible seafood choices.
You know, Christine, to echo what you were just saying, right now California fisheries fishermen are actually in a lot of trouble. They've worked hard to bring their fishery back. They've developed really good fishing practices that are cleaner than they used to be, and many of the new fishers that are in the business are doing a really good job, and they market quite often what they sell. So I think it's really important that consumers recognize that this is an important part of our economy. It's an important part of our culture. So not only being a wise seafood buyer is good for you, good for the planet, but it's also good for California fisheries, because it was such an important part of California's history. And we're not just seeing that in California, we're seeing that in many places around the country and around the world. So I think as people become better educated about how to discern good seafood and become more foodies, if you will, I think that's going to really change and promote sustainable fisheries.
Thank you, Christine and Chris, so much for joining us today on OceanWise, and thank you for joining us today too. We'll see you next time on OceanWise.